Hey everyone, we're back once again. I know it's been a minute since the last video. Our heads have been down fixing a lot of structural issues on the back end, making enemies not be invisible in multiplayer, lots of small things, but one really big major thing that I'm really excited about, and that's the loot system. We've finally gone into the early setup of the loot system, which you'll be seeing here on the screen. We have the inventory, previewing the weapons now, and then we have put 3 predetermined traits on the weapons, which these traits will eventually be randomly rolled, but we don't have to have something in the system to be able to talk about it, because I have been really itching to talk about a loot system for a while now. I've always had a fascination with loot systems ever since I sort of started playing Borderlands back in high school, Diablo 2, 3, Destiny of course, more recently Path of Exile. For me, these systems are very interesting because I think that similar to a really sharp shooting element or a very sharp movement mechanic, a loot system that's good can really help hold up a game. And I've had ideas for my own loot system for some time now. All those games I've mentioned, Borderlands, Diablo, Destiny, they all do things that I like, things I don't like, and we're going to kind of pull these together and kind of create what I like to imagine is my dream system for a loot system. So let's dive into it. For this video, I don't have a lot of footage for Project Fireteam because a lot hasn't changed other than this menu that you're seeing here. So you're going to be seeing me do some Destiny 2 as some like background footage. Feel free to just tune out the footage for now if you want, but let's dive into the system itself. So what do I define as a good loot system? Let's make something clear. Just because I think something makes a good loot system doesn't necessarily mean you will, but these ideas are things that I think are what kind of pull together something that's at least interesting. So first off, a loot system should be offering deep choices to the player. A deep choice doesn't necessarily mean thousands of options. It means that when you look under the hood and you look at the weapons that you have there and the options that the player has to choose from, there should be moments where they actually have to think and decide what do they take over something else. That usually means creating traits and perks that interact with each other, things that define the player's build. You could have thousands upon thousands of different options, but if all of them look essentially the same or they don't really interact with any of your other systems, personally to me, I think that's a bit of a miss. Another really key element of a good loot system is something that can create stories and can make a weapon feel personal. So by creating stories, I mean when you find something for the first time that you didn't even know that could possibly exist, or you've been finally looking for a weapon for dozens of hours and then you finally find this perfect roll that hits everything, or you just find a weapon one day that just hits every checkbox you wanted and you weren't even personally looking for it. For me, I have a story like that, and that's from Destiny when I did the Last Wish raid. It took us 6 to 8 hours because we had never done it before. We had a Sherpa taking us through it. I did it with a couple of my close buddies, and at the end, I got the raid exotic. It has like a 1% chance drop, and I managed to find this weapon, the 1K Voices. And maybe it's not the best weapon at all times. Recently, it's gotten a big glow up, but back then it was hit or miss, depending on the season you're in, but that didn't matter. The aesthetic of the weapon spoke to me. That moment of opening that chest and pulling that gear just added an extra element to it. So making sure that there's these times where you can create these stories. And then as for feeling personal, making a weapon feel unique to itself, that feels like you have found the only one in existence. You probably haven't. There's probably other people out there with it, but because it's not just a static roll, it feels unique to you. And finally, a good loot system should have depth and can provide adequate rewards for difficult and endgame content. This doesn't mean that you should have to spend 6 to 8 hours in a raid to find that perfect gear, but if you do, you should have a reward that justifies the effort that you put into it. A good loot system will allow you to feel lucky at times. You find something early or you get lucky and you find something really good even though you were on some lower end content, but generally going for that higher difficult content or that more endgame content should allow you to find stuff that you can't find elsewhere in the game, or it doesn't just feel like it was something that you can find elsewhere in the game with a +1 added onto it, essentially. But at the end of the day, we need to be realistic because me and my co-dev, we're just 2 people building this. So we need to take some liberties on how we're tackling this and be smart on how we're creating this. A lot of loot systems use the rarity system where you'll find a weapon that's common, and then there's another model for a blue, and then there's another model for a green version of it, then the legendary model. We can't really afford to create models for all these different tiers, which a lot of this gear is going to just be leveling gear. You get a common early on, and then you're never going to use it again. That's a waste of a model for us. So what we're going to be doing instead is the traits and perks that roll on a weapon have the rarities, and the highest rolled rarity sets the weapon's rarity. So what I mean by that is you might find a weapon model like an assault rifle that rolls 2 common traits and a legendary. Well, because you have that legendary trait on it, the weapon is now considered a legendary rarity when you quickly preview the weapon. You might have that exact same model, though, on something that's rolled maybe 3 rare traits. And since rare is the highest trait that was on that weapon, it's considered rare. So those weapons use the same models. Another thing this does is that for first-person shooters, sometimes when you have these different rarities attached to the model themselves, a player might find a model that they really like that's common or uncommon, and it feels perfect to use. But it doesn't have any of that endgame stats that you need because it's stuck on a low rarity. This allows us to circumvent that. All the gun's going to feel the same regardless, it's just the perks that change. And yes, the perks might alter the weapon's damage, its rate of fire, etc. a little bit, but that core feel of the gun will be the same across each rarity because the rarity is tied to the traits. And these traits won't be just limited to stat modifiers. Yes, there will be quite a few because that's at the end of the day, people want to slay out, people want to kill stuff, and they want to build around doing as much damage as possible. But it allows us to also do some weird things, such as a shotgun trait that blasts you backwards as you fire, which offers some interesting movement tech to work with the dash, ways to interact with keywords in the class system, or such as giving you some jump energy back while you're in the air and you get a kill, so you combine that with the jetpack jump to stay in the air longer, or maybe you combine it with a grenade launcher to kill a large number of enemies and get your double jump back. But one thing we're also going to be doing that's really important is that these common and rare traits, those lower rarity traits, they will be more focused on those stat modifiers, and that means if you do get a piece of gear that has like a legendary trait on it, but then it's paired with a common trait, you don't necessarily feel cheaped out because that you're going to know that that common trait will still give you things such as extra rate of fire or larger magazine size, or even create interesting interactions. For example, one of the common traits we've already put in the game is that the weapon's magazine is smaller, but its rate of fire has been increased when you're aiming down the sights. Maybe now you combine that with a legendary trait that also is built around the idea of aiming down sights, and now you see it doesn't feel so bad to have a legendary and a common trait combined. It doesn't make the weapon dead on arrival. But even if you do find a common or rare trait that doesn't quite feel right, we have also figured out a way to work around that, but we'll get back to that in a moment. On top of these traits that go common, rare, and legendary, we are also going to have weird guns equivalent to exotics and destinies or uniques in Path of Exile. But there's also going to be one more rarity of trait called a mythic rarity, which is basically super hard to find, very low drop chance, and basically turns that weapon into a pseudo-exotic, which opens up even more interesting combinations. When you find a mythic rarity trait that paired with either maybe you got really lucky and 2 legendary traits, or a mythic rarity and a common trait that does some really unique interaction between the two of them, the possibilities are endless. And one thing I did want to address is that mention of Destiny exotics. For those not familiar, in Destiny, a exotic weapon is when you find them once, the game can't really give you that as a proper reward again going forward, because all Destiny weapon exotics are static rolls. They're all the same. My version of 1K Voices is the same as your 1K Voices, and that means when you get to higher end content, if it does drop again, it doesn't really matter to me because I've already gone it once. It's just garbage or it's an infusion material. So our version of exotics are going to have one shared trait that they all share, and that really defines the weapon. So for example, it'd be like if it was 1K Voices, it sends out that big laser beam of fire. But then the other 2 traits are random from a set pool. So if we have, for example, a weapon called Carnivorous Twilight, your version of Carnivorous Twilight is going to be different from mine. Yes, they'll have that same base trait that maybe sucks energy out of the air, but then those other 2 traits that interact with its core trait will be different. So that means there's always a reason to keep finding more Carnivorous Twilight. When you find another one, you would want to open it up and see, well, is this trait better? Is it a different, more interesting combo? It makes it exciting to find that gear again. But we also know that loot grinding for that perfect roll is not for everyone. You don't want to necessarily always spend 8 to 10 hours just maybe find another Carnivorous Twilight. So what are we going to do about that? Well, we're going to take a page from Path of Exile, and this idea will help us deepen the loot reward further, and that's going to be through crafting materials. And this is what I mentioned earlier when I was talking about like if you find a trait that doesn't quite pair up with how you want. These crafting materials will be rare, not impossible to find, but not common either. They're essentially going to allow you to re-roll different traits of different rarities, such as re-rolling a common trait or a rare trait, even upgrading a common to a rare trait or a trait to a legendary trait, so that if you found, for example, a Carnivorous Twilight, and that legendary perk that you got on it or that common perk you got on it just isn't vibing with you, you can re-roll it. And since these resources are farmable, then you as a player can now choose to focus on trying to perfect your Carnivorous Twilight that you found, or save those resources for a different weapon and hope that another Carnivorous Twilight with a different perk combo drops down the line. And I should note here that we're also not putting like filler traits in the loot pool. If we ever find that there's a trait for a particular, what we're calling currently temporarily exotics, isn't really good for the weapon at all and that has no use case, then we will either buff it or we'll change the drop pool. But the idea is that you should always feel okay with the base roll that you get, and the only reason you would re-roll these traits is if you want to really perfect that weapon and fit into a very specific build. So the great part about the system is that we're going to be able to shower people in loot. One of Destiny's biggest issues is that their loot system isn't really deep enough. They have only up to tier 5 weapons that drop at higher difficulties, but since those have 3 traits to choose from in each column, it removes the need to farm pretty quickly as you're going to get that God roll. And that means that you don't really have a reason to go out and find more of these weapons, and it ends up just making things automatically dismantling. Combining that with exotic weapons being static so you have no reason to find the same exotic more than once, it really limits on what Bungie can reward, and it also makes scaling to higher difficulties hard without just giving a bunch of trash. But instead, what we can now do is we can now drop multiple guns. We could force some traits to be guaranteed legendary, or if you really push that super high difficulty, force one of those traits to be guaranteed mythic. If you go above and beyond to the highest possible difficulty, we could say, okay, you are now getting what the placeholder name of an exotic is, and that exotic is also going to be paired with a mythic trait, which would be super normally hard to find, but because you did that hardest end content, we can now reward players and it keeps scaling upwards. And then on top of that, we can start showering them in loot to help them even sharpen up that weapon. So we can say, okay, now you're also getting this craftable that lets you re-roll that mythic perk if you want it, in case you get a exotic with the mythic perk that you didn't want. This creates a real interesting loot chase that allows players to want to keep pushing their content harder and harder difficulties and reward them accordingly, and that is what I am truly excited about in this system. Thanks a lot for checking out this video, guys. Let me know in the comments below what's a loot system that you really vibe with, or how do you feel about this system that I've put forward in front of you. It's going to be a little bit before the next video. The next focus is going to be on actually creating loot drops, as right now those 3 traits are static, so obviously we want to make them random. And then after that, we'll be sharpening up some more of the back end stuff. But after that, I'm not really sure what we're going to be working on next. It might be the beginnings of the class system, or a test level, or perhaps even just working on some explosions so we can do grenades, grenade launchers, rockets. But I'm sure I'll have some more content soon enough. But if you don't hear from me, it's not because we're not working on the project. It's just because we have our heads down and we're working hard on it. And I can't wait to show you guys what we have next. So thanks again, guys. Catch you next time.